Color dodging is essentially luminosity painting, but with color. In many cases, luminosity painting with white yields just the right results. But in other cases where strong colors and colored light are involved, the color can get washed out as it gets lighter. For example, I'm going to luminosity paint these highlights in the sand with white to start. So I'll go ahead and grab a lights luminosity mask, create a dodge layer. And now I will luminosity paint those highlights in the sand here. They are getting brighter, but you can see that nice warm color is getting washed out. So what if we were to use that exact same selection, so I still have that luminosity selection, and make another dodge layer, and instead of painting with white, actually select a color that's in the sand, the color of the light that's there. And you have to experiment with what the exact right brightness and saturation of that color is, but usually I go a little brighter and maybe a little less saturated than the color I sampled. So we'll try that. And now when I luminosity paint with that color, I'm painting in some brightness, but notice that the color stays nice and rich compared to when I did it with white. So in a lot of cases, luminosity painting with color can really help maintain those colors that were in your image. And when the color is coming from a source of light, like this sunset light that's out here, then the natural color of the light that's shining on the landscape is what looks right. And of course, the luminosity selection makes it so you don't have to be quite as careful painting. But if the luminosity mask allowed the painting to go into some areas, like maybe in the water here where you didn't want it to go, at that point I would usually deselect. And then if you're using a transparent dodge layer, use the eraser tool. If you're using a 50% gray layer, then use a gray paintbrush. And now I can come back in and erase it out of any areas where it kind of went outside the boundaries of where I wanted it to go. Using a dodge layer, which is in the overlay blend mode, dodges with contrast. And in a lot of cases, especially where light is shining on something, that's probably what you want. But if I were to color dodge in the sky with a new dodge layer and select a color that's out there in that sunset sky, make it a little brighter and more saturated. When I paint out there, it's really strong. So for more kind of atmospheric haze or glow, it's better to use, instead of the overlay blend mode, use the soft light blend mode. And that provides a kind of softer, glowier effect. If you know you want to use soft light, instead of making a dodge layer and then changing the blend mode, let me go ahead and delete this one. You can just make a burn layer, because a burn layer is just a layer that is already set to soft light. And instead of burning with black, if we pick that same sunset color, now we're doing the exact same thing that we just did. And in this case, because I didn't use a luminosity selection as a stencil, I'm painting color into everything, even into the shadows where I don't want it. So if I realize that after the fact, I can come up, grab a luminosity selection for the darks, and then just load that as a selection, and then grab the eraser tool or the 50% gray brush, depending on what type of layer you're working on. And now I can just erase it out of those darker areas so that that warm glow is really just in the air and the brighter areas of the scene. I can also deselect that selection. And if I painted it in too much in just certain areas, I can also just completely erase it out of certain areas and just fine tune it until I get it looking just like I want. Another place color dodging with the haze or soft light setting works well is in clouds. So if I want some of that warm light hitting the highlights in the clouds a little more, I would create a luminosity mask that'll target those highlights. And I might modify that a little bit just to make sure that the highlights are nice and light and the shadows are protected. And then I'll go ahead and load that as a burn layer, and then pick that warm light that I want to be up in the clouds. And I actually think instead of quite so orange, I'm going to bring this more towards red a little bit and make it a little brighter. And now I can paint that in. That's a little too saturated, so let's back up and let's get something a little less saturated and not quite so bright. And now let's try painting that in. Yeah, that looks a little better. I still don't quite like the color, so I'm going to back that off. And I think I went too red, so let's go back towards orange a little bit. Let's try this. There we go. Yeah, now that's painting in some of that sunset light to the underside of the clouds. And I'll deselect and grab the eraser tool, and then I can erase it out of places I went outside the lines, like here in the blue sky. And I also think it went up into this area a little more than I wanted it to. Maybe something like that. And I realized I want to do on my original dodge layer where I was dodging around the edge of the pool, I want to bring that in a little bit more down here. So I'll go back and grab that lights mask again, load that as a selection because I already have the layer, and make sure I get the paintbrush tool. Don't want the eraser tool. And I think that's probably still the right color, but just in case, I'm going to sample out there just to make sure. And now I'm going to paint that in through this foreground area as well. Make sure all the highlights are getting that. And if I went too far in some areas, grab the eraser and just back it off a little bit. Okay, let's check this out. With that amount of color dodging work, this is the image before, and this is the image after. Before, after. Ryan Dyer developed this technique and is the true master of it. His technique is meticulous and it enables him to achieve the signature look that he's known for. I'm not nearly as good at it as he is, so you should check out his tutorials if you want to see this technique applied by someone who's really skilled at the craft. And if you've watched Ryan's tutorials, in some of them he shows how to record actions that make what he calls his dodge with contrast and dodge with haze layers. And I just wanted to point out that the TK dodge button makes the same layer as Ryan's dodge contrast layer, and the TK burn button makes the same layer as Ryan's dodge haze layer. So if you already use Ryan's techniques, his layers can easily be made with the TK plugin. Color dodging works best with images that already have natural glowing light and start out somewhat dark and low contrast. That's what enables you to build in the light and the color contrast. Here's how I might use the technique on this image. I'll start by selecting a luminosity mask that targets the highlights in the rocks here. Probably going to be the yellow channel that really does a good job of it. And I'm going to modify that a bit to enable me to really color dodge in the highlights. And then I'll create a dodge layer with the luminosity mask stencil. And instead of dodging with white, I'm going to pick a color. And it's probably going to be a color that's in the rock already in those areas. But because there's going to be warm light that's coming in from the sky, I might go slightly more yellow with it. And of course, in this case, brighter and probably slightly less saturation. Let's try that. So now I can begin dodging that in. Let's see, that's a 20% flow. That's probably good. This enables you to really kind of build it up slowly and incrementally, and you can paint more in some areas than others. And across the sides of these stacks in the back and into this area. And let it fade off towards the edges to create kind of a vignette as we go. Let's see how that's looking. Yeah, I think that's coming in great. And I may want to add even a little bit brighter colored highlight in there. So I'm going to come back and make a new selection now that we've added more brightness into this image. And again, actually, let's come to the color luminosity adjustment, And that'll enable me to even brighten up those reds and yellows more. There's not really any blues in the rock. There is in the sky, but anyway, I think that's better. But I'm also going to come to curves, create more mask contrast one more time. I'm going to create a new dodge layer and grab a color, move it a little bit more towards yellow and brighter and not quite so saturated. And now paint that in just in a few areas where those highlights are the strongest. Okay, let's see how we're doing so far. Before, after, before, after. I like how it looks on the landscape. Of course, I'm painting outside the lines into the sky. So this is where I would make a land selection, which I can do by double clicking on that button. And now I can select both of these dodge layers and put them in a group with a white mask. And that folder mask will be the land selection. And that now isolates my color dodging just to the land and keeps it out of the sky. So before and after, before and after. And let's use this technique on one more image. So again, starting with this image that's already fairly dark, I had to underexpose for that bright highlight of the sun coming through the fog. And then in the raw file, I lifted the shadows, but I also decreased contrast. So we're starting from a dark, low contrast starting point. I want to paint this light coming in and better showcase where it's illuminating the ferns and the foliage in the forest floor. So let's look for a luminosity mask. Often it's going to be yellow, the one that really targets those highlights, and also those yellow-green foliage colors. And I can come to the color luminosity adjustment to brighten them up even more. Also with the greens, and also increase the mask contrast even more. We'll try that. Add that to a dodge layer and select a color. And it's going to be this color of green that the ferns already are, I think, but much lighter and not quite as saturated. And now I can begin painting that in down here into these fern highlights so we can see that light coming from the sun down through all that foliage where it's being backlit and illuminated by that light source. Really bring that in well up into these branches a little bit. Now I'm being careful to stay out of the fog up here because I don't want to have green fog. And I may end up going outside the lines a little bit up into the fog. Let's see how we're doing here. Yeah, I think it's looking great on the foliage, but I am getting a little green fog back there. I'm going to continue painting this in as much as I can. And if you ever get to a point where you've put as much color onto the layer as you can, and you want to keep going, you can make another dodge layer above it. And with that same color, we'll have to go in and resample the color here. Get back to where we were, something like that. Now with that same luminosity selection, I can continue painting and color dodge a little more. And maybe back in here as well. And I want to paint the green out of my fog, but I don't want to back paint it out of my foliage because I want it in there. So what I'm going to do is use a zone mask, which can have a very narrow focus for the luminosity in the fog, and use that as a stencil to erase the green out of the fog. So I sampled in the fog, and I can even look to see if I can tweak it a little bit to really dial it in and increase the whites and maybe bring down the blacks. And now I'm going to load that as a selection and grab the eraser tool. And let's see, there's some of the green fog is coming from this layer. So I'll erase through there on that layer. That's better. And there's a little bit of the green fog coming through on that layer. So now I will erase through there on that layer as well. A little bit still in that area. And I can also deselect and just do a final pass with the eraser to make sure I've got it all out of the fog. Let's see how we're looking now. Yeah, so bringing in that light really nicely. And my ferns are retaining that green color that they actually are. They're not getting washed out. And I want to extend this into the fog a little bit as well. So I'm going to do a little color dodging in the fog. So I'm going to start with just a Lights 1 mask of the fog up there. I'll go ahead and load that to a dodge layer. And in this area, I'm going to sample the color of the fog, which is actually a slight blue color. So I don't want to go too blue. I don't want blue fog, but I do want to keep in the same general color tone in that area. But I am going to go lighter and a slightly more blue in this case. And now I can dodge that in through here and let that come across and down into the foliage to kind of blend better through there. And then I'm going to do this one more time. Grab that Lights 1 luminosity mask and make one more dodge layer. And this time sample the color of the fog that's up here. Interestingly, I thought it would be orange, but it's more of a magenta. Oh, there's a little orange there, but I think I want to go with whatever's over here. Something like that. Slightly lighter, not much lighter, but maybe just slightly more of that color. And that's the color of the fog that's up higher. So I'm also going to bring that through and blend that down into this cooler fog, and then also blend that down into the foliage as well, and the side of the tree, and across like that. And now let's check it out. Before, after, before, after. So bringing some color into your luminosity painting to make it color dodging can really be a powerful effect when you're working with images like this.